Well, good evening to you all. 1 month ago, President Niels Maastricht announced a groundbreaking partnership with the Brookings Institution to create Brookings Mountain West. And the purpose of the initiative is to connect and expand research efforts addressing the Intermountain West and the national and international research that Brookings is so well known for. Specifically, Brookings Mountain West builds upon the work of Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, which focuses on helping metropolitan areas like Las Vegas grow in robust, inclusive, and, most importantly, sustainable ways. We believe that in this economic downturn, we are in an ideal position to readjust and emerge as a stronger community and region. One of the key players in the Metropolitan Policy Program is Dr. Rob Lang, who has now joined our faculty as a professor of my favorite department, sociology, and that's my department, and research director of the Brookings Mountain West. Rob will work closely with his co-research director, Mark Muro, in Washington, D.C., to continue researching issues they highlighted last year in their significant work called Mountain Megas. The next step in the Mountain Mega study will be to follow through on the recommendations in that report and ensure actions take place in the 5-state region of Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. To begin this dialogue, Brookings Mountain West will convene a high-profile conference with the governors and key leaders of these states sometime in the next year. We are really looking forward to that event. Tonight, we are here to present another key element of Brookings Mountain West. Our partnership with Brookings is allowing us to bring to our community the perspective of a variety of Brookings experts on domestic and international economic policy, foreign policy, and governance. 10 Brookings scholars are going to make a total of 20 visits to UNLV during this next academic year alone, and deliver lectures, talk with classes, conduct research, network with faculty, students, and community leaders. In a few moments, you'll be introduced to tonight's speaker by Associate Professor David Hasenzahl, Acting Director of the School of Environmental and Public Affairs, a unit that was just recently created by the merger of the Departments of Environmental Studies and Public Administration. One of the many benefits of the visits by Brookings scholars is that is giving our faculty members an opportunity to interact with them both academically and socially. For each visitor, we have selected 2 faculty members to serve as Brookings faculty liaisons and 1 or 2 graduate students to assist them as Brookings graduate liaisons. These faculty and students serve as hosts for the duration of each scholar's visit to UNLV. They set the schedule for the scholars, set up seminars for UNLV faculty and students, and introduce them to members of the Las Vegas community who can assist them in gaining insight into the problems facing Las Vegas and Nevada and the region. I would like to ask David Hasenzahl, Dennis Peregis of our Department of Political Science, and Environmental Studies doctoral student Amy Northrup to stand and be recognized for their participation as liaisons to Dr. Ebinger. And before we move on to the introduction of tonight's speaker, I have just a few housekeeping reminders. First, our next scholar will visit in early November. Dr. Pietro Nivolo, who holds the C. Douglas Dillon Chair in Governance at Brookings, will speak on the topic, the title of The Long and Winding Road, Automotive Fuel Economy and American Politics. For all of you who are driving cars, you'll probably find that of interest. The date and time for this lecture are not yet finalized, so sign up for our mailing list in the lobby in order to receive an invitation. You might want to jot down the URL for the Brookings Mountain West website, which is shown behind me on the screen, because the PowerPoint presentation from tonight's lecture, in a few weeks, the video and transcript will be posted there. This is a really informative website. And finally, just like they say at the movie theater, as a courtesy to our lecturer and fellow guests, and as I would say in earlier days to my Sociology 101 class, please silence your cell phones. Now, without further delay, let me welcome Dr. David Hasenzahl to the stage to introduce tonight's Brookings Scholar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. It is certainly the hallmark of a vibrant university that it has a variety of guests coming in, and I've noticed the last couple of weeks there are almost too many talks to go to, and there are a lot of UNLV faculty going out to give talks elsewhere, and that's very exciting to me. And this Brookings cooperation is also exciting to me as the director of the School of Environmental and Public Affairs. It's exactly the kinds of things we're doing, and I hope this will result in a lot of interesting interactions in the forthcoming years. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Charles Ebinger. He's the director of the Energy Security Initiative at the Brookings Institution. Before he joined Brookings, he was a senior energy advisor at the International Resources Group. He's an avid teacher, and he's currently an adjunct professor at the NITSA School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And he previously taught as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service from 1979 to 2003. Dr. Ebinger has 30 years of experience addressing the security, political, economic, environmental, and foreign policy interrelationships surrounding domestic and international energy issues. Experience he gained while working as an executive at a variety of energy-related companies throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, in work both domestic and abroad. He currently serves on the board of directors of the Washington chapter of the International Association of Energy Economists. He received his BA from Williams College and PhD from the Fletcher School of International Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Please join me in welcoming Charles Ebinger to the stage.
Well, one might say, why the Arctic? And I would only say, back in my first job in government in 1974, one day I was in the precursor of our Department of Energy today, precursor agency, and someone came through and said, we have to have a person on an interagency group on the Arctic and the Antarctic. Who's interested? And knowing nothing about either region, I said, I am. And ever since then, it has caught my imagination. I teach about the Arctic and the Antarctic in the courses I have taught over the years. So it's in that context I hope I can get you a bit enthused about this important area of the world which all too often doesn't get... sorry, that was a good start. Global climate change has catapulted the Arctic into the center of geopolitics as melting Arctic ice transforms the region from one of primarily scientific interest into a maelstrom of competing commercial, national security, and environmental concerns with profound implications for the international legal and political system. The significance of an Arctic rendered increasingly accessible by the melting of the polar ice as a result of rising global temperatures should not be underestimated. As the region opens to increased human activity, such as traffic from commercial shipping, tourism, and oil and gas exploration, soot emitted by maritime vessels and operations will land on the ice. Graying of the ice cap as black carbon from incomplete hydrocarbon combustion lodges itself in snow and ice. This causes what was once a reflective surface to absorb more sunlight, melt, further warming the water. The resulting dangerous feedback loop is part of an alarming phenomenon that is pushing the current drive for policies to slow down global climate change. Increasing water temperatures are changing the distribution of sea ice and having grave impacts on ice-dependent flora and fauna. In September 2009, nearly 3,500 walruses congregated on Alaska's northwest coast off the Chukchi Sea, and I realize some of these places you will have no idea where they are. I remember when I tried to learn them. Because of reduced sea ice. The same thing happened in 2007 with over 6,000 walruses. Polar bears are likely to face extinction in less than 70 years as they lose their traditional breeding and hunting grounds and melting ice. Red foxes are migrating ever northwards and displacing smaller Arctic foxes. The list goes on and on of such events. The loss of permafrost animals and fish is having a devastating effect on the native peoples of the region, whose cultures continue to be intricately linked with them. The Inuit hunting culture is directly threatened by changes not only in the physical geography of the environment, but in the composition of the animal population. Villages along the Bering and Chukchi Sea coasts have been relocated already because of melting permafrost and consequent coastal erosion. And while the impact on marine life is not yet fully known, signs of change can already be observed in the migration of certain fish species off the coast of Greenland and in fish growth and size. Any changes in marine life will also affect the nature of fisheries in the region and will require policies to facilitate sustainable operations and address potential conflict as fishing grounds and national boundaries, as we will see in a few minutes, frequently overlap and are in contention. The rapidity of Arctic melt is no longer the phantasmagoria of futuristic movies such as the terrible film The Day After Tomorrow, but is occurring at a rate unfathomable just a few years ago. In 2007 alone, more than 1 million square miles of ice melted. This is the ice cap in August 1979, and here's a picture in 2007, 79, 2007. In 2007 and again in 2008, the Northwest Passage was open for 2 weeks, and predictions are being made of ice-free Arctic summers as early as 2013. These events are not limited to the North American Arctic. For the last few years, the northern sea route along Russia's north coast has seen similar ice changes, providing Russia with greater access to its vast Siberian resources and leading to bold assertions of sovereignty by Russia over vast swaths of the Polar Sea. Indeed, the region has already opened up to global commerce for the first time when just this last August, on the 21st, for the first time, 2 German commercial ships, unaccompanied by icebreakers, were traversing the northern sea route on a voyage from Vladivostok to the Netherlands. In response to these developments, in July 2009, our National Ocean and Geographic Society began characterizing the Arctic Sea with imaging via unmanned aerial vehicles. They examined the types of ice floating in the Arctic Ocean as they pass through the Fram Strait in Canada between Greenland and Svalbard and into the Atlantic Ocean. What this imaging showed is that the amount of multi-year sea ice declined by 74% since as recently as 1988, and that the oldest ice, that is the ice that is always there, now covers only 2% of the Arctic Ocean, in contrast to the 20% that old ice characterized as recently as the 1980s. The prospect of longer ice-free periods in the Arctic has momentous implications for the region's commercial developments, which in turn risks further melting of the Arctic ice by this enhanced activity. In 2009, the United States Geological Survey postulated that over 90 billion barrels of oil and nearly 1,700 trillion cubic feet of natural gas potentially lie in the Arctic region. With longer ice-free periods now available to explore for hydrocarbons, a new scramble for oil and gas could well occur, especially if oil prices once again recover to levels above $100 a barrel. In addition, new technological developments already occurring in marine surface and undersea logistics, as well as deep water drilling technology, have increased the salience of issues relating to the extension of coastal states' respective continental shelves under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, known as UNCLOS, and the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, known by the acronym CLCS. It is the thesis of my partner, Evi Zambatakis, who helped me do this research, that Arctic melt poses economic, military, and environmental challenges to the governance of the region, and that technological limitations, while they may be a barrier to access in the short term, that technological developments will in the long run be an enabler of Arctic development. Decreased sea ice gives countries more opportunities to plant infrastructure to enable the exploration of hydrocarbons and minerals and to gain greater access for commercial shipping and fishing. While the military has a long-standing presence in the Arctic, greater access means the nature of this presence will have to adjust to take on new roles and capabilities, such as increased capacity for search and rescue operations and border patrolling, and submarine adaptation to reduce opaque ice cover and potentially increase monitoring of the waters by all the Arctic littoral states. Let me turn for a minute to questions relating to the environment. The Arctic is a complex environment. While sea passage may be ice-free for a portion of the year, the term can, however, be extremely misleading. Multi-year ice is clearly receding, but freely floating younger, uncharted ice is more dangerous to navigate. In addition to releasing harmful greenhouse gases, the warming of the Arctic tundra is leading to the proliferation of rapid, large plant growth, which, like black carbon, darkens the landscape and further warms the ice caps. Melting tundra also raises vexing problems about the construction of land-based energy infrastructure in projects such as the long-proposed Arctic natural gas transportation system, which would bring Alaskan and Canadian natural gas to the lower 48 states and to southern Canada, since the unstable ground may not be able to support the overland pipeline infrastructure required for the project. If these developments continue as forecast, they may focus attention increasingly on the possibilities for seaborne transportation of liquefied natural gas, with significant implications for the geopolitics of the far northern regions. As ice melts and water warms, fish are moving ever further northwards. A lot of the anecdotal evidence that we thought on the Pacific North Coast, both Oregon, Washington, and on up to British Columbia, the Coast Guard now believes that the fish have not disappeared as much from overfishing as the fact that with the warming waters, they are migrating northwards. We get anecdotal evidence from native populations that they are catching fish never seen before on a massive scale, and that traditional fish are disappearing. Whether that's because of invasive species or not, no one's quite sure. As the ice melts and waters warm, fish are moving ever northwards. Fish do not clearly recognize national boundaries, which makes management of fisheries potentially contentious as stocks cross maritime frontier. Moreover, as some species of fish move north, animals such as the walrus, which live south of the far polar north, are seeing their traditional sources of protein disappear and at grave risk as a result. Inuit tribes report massive drops in the walrus and seal populations, two vital commodities for their own livelihoods. The polar bear, already adversely affected by changes in fish and other marine populations, has access to ever less of the floating ice that is vital to the polar bear habitat. In August 2009, very recently, the Obama administration approved the Arctic Fishery Management Plan to prevent the expansion of commercial fishing into Arctic waters exposed by Arctic ice melt, an area of approximately 150,000 square miles. The impact of the movement of existing fish stocks and the introduction of new species traditionally found in waters further south has yet to be fully assessed. But determining the impact of these new dynamics on the fragile ecosystem will be a necessary precondition to the effective management of any commercial fishing in the region. The overall effectiveness of the Obama plan depends in part on whether other Arctic states will follow suit, as maintaining the right to rush to these newly accessible fishing grounds without a sustainable management structure in place could deplete fish populations far sooner than is widely appreciated. As noted above, turning again to the indigenous peoples of the Arctic are intimately tied to the environment. The effects of climate change on the region are a double-edged sword for these communities, which at present lack access to some of the basic amenities of modernity by virtue of their geographic location, geophysical terrain, and neglect by central governments. On the one hand, melting ice will be to their disadvantage in respect to their traditional way of life. On the other hand, an Arctic region more accessible to lucrative activities such as the exploitation of hydrocarbons, fish, and minerals will necessarily attract increased governmental attention and thus could benefit the citizens of the region. While these communities have gained limited measures of political power, they have yet to exploit their economic potential. Oil and mining companies will increasingly have to consider the interests of these indigenous communities when evaluating potential projects in the Arctic. Not to do so will be, in my view, at their peril. The Sami peoples, for example, of northern Norway, already have been granted legal rights to certain local resources and are pushing for compensation from the companies that exploit them. The Inuit Circumpolar Council, which represents the natives in our part of Alaska, which represents not only the Alaskan Inuit but also those in Denmark and Canada and Russia, launched its Circumpolar Inuit Declaration on Arctic Sovereignty on April 28th of this year, 2009, stating, and I quote, "It is our right to freely determine our political status, freely pursue our economic, social, cultural, and linguistic development, and freely dispose of our natural wealth and resources." Denmark is already scaling back its massive subsidies to Greenland's Inuit population in line with the latter's moves towards greater independence and the potential for wealth generation from the exploitation of hydrocarbons and minerals. Some people believe that Greenland may be the place where very large petroleum resources may be found, albeit at huge costs to exploit them. The Canadian government set up the territory of Nunavut a decade ago, granting some home rule powers to the Canadian Inuit. Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper has called for the construction of new Arctic military base in Resolute Bay and the refurbishment of a deep-sea Arctic port in the Northwest Territories, an area of great concern to the Inuit people. He has also called to enhance Canadian sovereignty in the region by the construction of 6 to 8 new icebreakers. While the global economic crisis has hampered the short to medium term feasibility of all these aspirations for development, it also brings to light the concurrent issues affecting the Inuit from northern Quebec, whom the government encouraged to move to Resolute Bay as long ago as 1953 in order to ensure that Canadian citizens lived as far north as possible to maintain Canadian sovereignty in the face of a Russian threat of expansion during the Cold War. However, these people have long been abandoned to a region which lacks access to infrastructure, education, medical care, and job opportunities. Alcoholism and suicide rates are extremely high, and most young people end up dropping out of school at a very early age. The presence of these populations in the regions extends the national interests of Arctic states such as Canada, the United States, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Russia far to the north. But these communities must not be treated more than as flag holders for their country's northernmost borders, and more importantly, they will not allow themselves to be treated that way any longer. Let me turn for a quick moment to issues of resources and shipping routes, which the graph on the screen will show. The potential hydrocarbon bonanza of the Arctic holds much potential economic benefit for indigenous communities and the Arctic states they call home. Although detailed information on Arctic petroleum resources remain limited, according to the USGS report, it appears that the ratio of gas to oil in the region's hydrocarbons, got ahead of myself, let me go back. It appears that the ratio of gas to oil is 3-to-1. While the Arctic may have tremendous potential in the long run, however, its contribution to global energy resources in the short term should not be overestimated, as other areas of the world are cheaper to explore, less politically contentious, and less technologically challenging to exploit. The technology to recover Arctic resources years round is not yet readily available and will probably not become so in the very short term. Transport difficulties add to the problems to be overcome. Natural gas requires pipelines or expensive and complex liquefaction infrastructure. The former is the less likely option because, as noted, pipelines have to travel over very long distances and often with sinking tundra resources. With technological breakthroughs in the development of shale gas resources in the lower 48 states over the last 4 years, meanwhile, U.S. natural gas reserves in the lower 48 have quadrupled, making interest in the northern resources less immediate on the agenda. Technology is a key barrier to Arctic access in other ways. Icebreakers, many nuclear-powered, are necessary for presence and power projection year-round. The various Arctic nations have widely divergent capabilities in this area. For example, and this is something I think we should be alarmed by, for example, Russia has 20 icebreakers, Canada has 12 and is working on budgeting for 8 more. The U.S., to all intents and purposes, has just 1 functional icebreaker, which amazingly traverses both from the Arctic to the Antarctic, depending on the season of the year. In effect, the United States has no meaningful icebreaker presence in the region. Icebreakers take some 8 to 10 years to build, cost approximately $1 billion apiece. The global economic crisis has, however, clearly put a strain on national budgets, and icebreaker fleets are unlikely to expand rapidly as a result in the short term. Nonetheless, even if the U.S. started building tomorrow, it would remain far behind other Arctic states such as Russia and Canada, taking decades and perhaps at least $20 billion to catch up. In light of forecast increases in shipping traffic in Arctic waters, the Arctic Council conducted an Arctic maritime shipping assessment in this year, 2009, calling for mandatory regulations on ship construction standards, which are currently only voluntary and vary greatly among countries. The International Maritime Organization, or the IMO, is discussing whether to adopt the recommendations of that assessment, and a final decision is expected soon. Much of the geology supporting the presence of hydrocarbons in the Arctic is already located within the exclusive economic zones of the Arctic littoral states. Therefore, an extension of a state's continental shelf beyond the EEZ may not necessarily yield that much more oil and gas, but no one is certain for sure. The perception, however, of so-called strategic finds, if they occur, may, however, be enough to motivate additional territorial claims, and such perceptions that strategic resources somehow lie in the Arctic fuels the use of euphemisms by international relations theorists, such as the new scramble for the Arctic, with references to what has otherwise, to date, been a fairly orderly process following international laws and norms. In addition to hydrocarbon resources, new shipping routes opened up as the Arctic ice vanishes will reduce substantially the maritime distances between Europe and Asia, while also providing strategic alternatives to countries such as Japan, which have an immense interest in Arctic access owing to its current dependence almost overwhelmingly on shipping through the politically volatile Straits of Malacca for most of its energy supplies. Use of the Northwest Passage over North America could shorten shipping routes between Asia and the U.S. East Coast by nearly 5,000 miles. However, even though Canada is a strong ally of the United States, there are serious disputes between the two countries over the waters of the Canadian archipelago, with Canada claiming the waters as internal waters not subject to the conventions of so-called innocent passage, while the U.S. regards them as a strait for international navigation through which ships should be allowed to pass without interference by Canadian authorities. While neither country wishes this issue to loom larger in their bilateral relations, and both prefer at the moment to agree to disagree, under the current position, All U.S. Coast Guard vessels are designated as research vessels, which are therefore required to request transit permission from the Canadian government. This is not, however, a long-term solution. If the waterway does indeed become increasingly ice-free in the future, Canada will be forced to formally resolve its dispute with the United States and other nations over the status of the Northwest Passage. The Northern Sea Route over here, the Northern Sea Route over Eurasia is also important, and perhaps more so, since it shortens shipping routes between Northern Europe and Northeast Asia by 40% compared with the existing routes through the Suez or Panama canals, and takes thousands of miles off maritime routes around Africa and Latin America. While experts have diverse views over which a new maritime passage will become more important, there is a fledgling consensus that the Northern Sea Route will open sooner than the Northwest Passage, a contention bolstered by the passage of the German ships this August alluded to before. As well as shorter shipping times, the potential benefits of an ice-free Arctic thruway include the ability to avoid dangerous choke points based on piracy, which we've now seen off the coast of Africa, and lower transportation costs. However, despite optimistic public perceptions often shaped by the mainstream media, the potential risks may actually counter and delay these perceived benefits. These routes will not necessarily be more efficient. Ice-capable ships required for the transit of Arctic waters are clearly more expensive to build and procure and burn much more fuel than those currently used for long-distance conventional maritime transport. Likewise, while Arctic ice melt may be accelerating, year-to-year variations still occur, meaning that passages open one year may be closed the next. The uncertainty of when and whether passages are open increases the risk for commercial cargoes that they may incur large demurrage charges if they are late in arriving at final destinations, thereby offsetting some of the cost advantages of the shorter sea routes. Finally, the potential for dangerous weather patterns to emerge in warming waters, combined with difficult to navigate broken ice and the lack of adequate maritime traffic management, may make the Arctic transit a treacherous undertaking even under the best of conditions. Hydrocarbon prices and concerns about energy security are clearly the key drivers in accelerating interest in the Arctic, since high energy prices will generate new technological developments that are difficult to justify when prices are even at current levels. New technology, especially that which allows drilling in deep water, also potentially opens vast areas of the Arctic to oil and gas exploration. New technology that can withstand ice flows will be of special benefit to Russia, since most of the waters along the Northern Sea Route are relatively shallow with large sedimentary basins extending up to 200 and 300 miles offshore, and it is sedimentary basins where we most frequently find oil and gas. Conducting business in the Arctic requires specialized ice-capable equipment ranging from drilling and transportation infrastructure to established refueling depots. To the extent that high prices support these costly projects, they will accelerate commercial interest in the region. Domestic and global economic conditions will also affect the progress, scale, as well as the feasibility of major Arctic projects. Canada, for example, given these considerations, has already begun to scale back its proposed very dramatic Arctic expenditures. Let me turn for a moment to the issue of governance. The Arctic is geologically complex, largely uncharted, and rife with overlapping sovereignty claims that will affect all commercial activities, including hydrocarbons and fisheries development, which may have a momentous impact, as noted, on the region's indigenous populations. This is kind of a terrible map, but I'll talk to it. States with territorial borders in the Arctic, as generally defined, are clearly the United States, Canada, Russia, Denmark via its ownership of Greenland, and Norway via the Svalbard archipelago, which is this thought I had an arrow here. Anyway, it's this island chain up here above Norway. Together, these states are known as the Arctic Five. While possessing no direct borders on the Arctic Ocean, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland are also usually considered Arctic states, though this depends on what definition of Arctic one uses. Countries on every continent have a long-standing interest in the Arctic, as evidenced by a number of signatories to both the Svalbard and Spitsbergen treaties. Indeed, South Korea, China, Japan, and India have all sponsored Arctic scientific expeditions. Yet other nations within various international frameworks argue that the Arctic should remain open to all nations under the international legal concept of the common heritage of mankind. Many nations reject the claims of the Arctic powers that the Arctic region should be carved up by them and them alone. With increased human activity comes a myriad of management and sovereignty issues. Tourism to the region by cruise ships is on a dramatic rise, raising concerns about the ability of each state in the region to provide search and rescue facilities if a large ship were suddenly to find itself in danger. Many of these ships are not ice capable, and even though the Arctic ice is melting, as I mentioned, year-to-year sea ice variation can still be dramatic, with uncharted broken ice and passages open one year, frozen the next. Regulation of maritime traffic will also require accident cleanup capacity. This problem will rise dramatically in importance if oil and gas production accelerates in the region. Oil spills are far more difficult to clean up in cold, icy waters. As oil decomposes slowly, ice interferes with the process, while technology to handle spills in these temperatures is lacking. Spills can also cause graying of the ice cap, thereby further speeding the rate of melting ice caps. Strengthened legal and regulatory frameworks in the Arctic will be necessary to attract international investment and development. The debate on the future of Arctic governance centers on whether to create a new or use existing multinational framework and institutional agreements. Although the U.S. enforces the law of the sea without having ratified it, it lags behind the rest of the Arctic states on its Arctic policy and in asserting its presence. In the last days of the Bush administration, and with little fanfare, a 10-page national security and Homeland Security Presidential Directive on Arctic Policy was released, the first review since 1994. The directive was based on developments in the region stemming from climate change and increased human activity, the likely accessibility of vast mineral, hydrocarbon, and fishing resources, and the recognition that the U.S. has, and I quote, broad and fundamental national security interests in the Arctic region. It addresses international governance, extended continental shelf and boundary issues, the promotion of international scientific cooperation, maritime transportation, economic and energy issues, environmental protection, and conservation of natural resources. And most importantly, the document recognizes that the most effective way to achieve international recognition and legal certainty for U.S. claims to the Outer Continental Shelf should be done through the Law of the Sea Convention, even though we remain outside the Law of the Sea Convention. The Law of the Sea was created in 1982. Any signatory that can prove that its continental shelf extends beyond 200 nautical miles from its shoreline is automatically entitled to legal rights, allowing it to exploit oil, gas, and minerals in this zone. This provision is a one-off opportunity. The extension must be claimed within 10 years of signing the convention. Countries can extend their claim to 350 nautical miles from 200 if scientific proof based on geology can be obtained showing that the undersea continental plate or ridge is an extension of its main territory. Determining that this is the case is obviously extremely complex and contentious, expensive and time-consuming, as the ambiguities in Article 76 of the treaty, which defines the continental shelf, cannot possibly cover every circumstance owing to the difficult and varied geology and topography of overlapping claims. The UN lacks the institutional capacity to streamline this lengthy review process. Consequently, some states have called for the creation of a new institution to address the issue. In the view of my colleague and myself, member states should commit to building capacity inside the law of the sea rather than creating yet another international institution. Moreover, completely shifting authority from an existing organization to a new one will disrupt policies and programs that are progressing along different tracks and at varying speeds. For example, applications to the convention which have different deadlines depending on the date of submission, given that you have 10 years to do this. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that, as I've noted, the U.S. has yet to sign the law of the sea, even though it stands to gain considerable territory from ratification. As a non-signatory state, the U.S. has little or no credibility. As a non-signatory state, the U.S. has little credibility in any discussion on Arctic sovereignty and cannot assert its own right over resources off the Alaskan coast beyond the 200-mile economic zone. Notwithstanding U.S. enforcement of the law of the sea, a number of members of Congress are concerned about the failure of the U.S. to ratify the convention. Nonetheless, in the Senate, which has to approve the law of the sea treaty before ratification can take place, there is a handful of individuals opposed to ratification, fearful of ceding too much sovereignty to a supranational organization and of agreeing to an unfavorable allocation of resources. This is just an interesting photo of giving you an idea of what it's like to traverse this region. This goes back to the discussion we had of how far the United States is behind in our own icebreaker efforts. This shows the natural gas to oil ratio that I discussed earlier. These senators who are opposed to ratification believe that key provisions of UNCLOS could paralyze the unfettered movement of the U.S. Navy, the most powerful Navy in the world. They consider customary international law sufficient to deal with these so-called new Arctic maritime issues, since general international cooperation has thus far prevailed. The debate over signing the law of the sea is politically interesting in that it has brought together a diverse coalition representing the oil industry, the military, and the environmental community on the same side of the debate. These groups realize that without stable legal frameworks, there will be no oil and gas exploration, and this will be detrimental to U.S. national and energy security. The Navy's leadership has pointed out that there are frameworks under the convention that will protect the Navy's right to patrol the Arctic. Environmental groups want the U.S. to join the law of the sea so that it has a seat at the table to ensure the protection of the Arctic's flora and fauna. The real absurdity of the U.S. not ratifying UNCLOS is that while the U.S. Senate dithers, other states are rushing out to claim extensions to their respective continental shelves. By not signing, the U.S. is effectively ceding over 200,000 square miles of undersea territory in the Arctic, not to mention another 100,000 square miles off the Gulf of Mexico and East Coast, which together are equivalent in size to 2 Californias. The U.S. currently relies on customary international law to govern its Arctic activities. Customary international law derives from the consistent general practice of states out of a sense of legal obligation as codified in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, and holds unless it conflicts with the obligations of a member state under the UN Charter. This gets a bit arcane. The high seas is the designation traditionally given to areas that are beyond the territorial waters of states and therefore not subject to national jurisdiction or appropriation. However, by signing the convention, Washington would enhance its tools for combating maritime trafficking and potential piracy, strengthen its jurisdiction over its own Arctic backyard and the potential resources it contains, and create a more stable international framework with clear delimitations of sovereignty, allowing exploration and production in the region to become more attractive to energy and mining companies and allow greater attention to global environmental concerns. However, given the technological risks of operating in such an environment and the huge capital and operating costs involved, it is vital that clear and unambiguous legal and regulatory frameworks be put in place. A crystal clear legal and regulatory regime is a prerequisite not only for energy and mining projects, but also for the effective management of fisheries, the operation of commercial shipping, and management of accidents that occur beyond national boundaries, as well as any other potential activities that might arise. U.S. ratification of the convention will reinforce and protect existing international law regarding the movement of U.S. military and civilian ships, as well as the right of innocent passage, transit passage, the access to archipelago sea lanes, and freedom of the high seas. Critics of UNCLOS, however, are abundant, and they cite the lack of transparency of Article 76 governing sovereignty as one of the convention's fatal flaws. Under Article 76, submissions by Arctic states are not amazingly made readily available to all other member states, with the result that states are unable to challenge assertions where they may have territorial conflicts, especially as to extensions of their outer continental shelf, since they often do not see the full logic behind each other's argumentation. Not seeing the actual submissions sometimes makes it difficult for signatory states to understand the justification for decisions by UNCLOS. In addition, opponents of UNCLOS argue that the language of Article 76 is ambiguous, leaving critical definitions of terms unclear. They also argue that while UNCLOS is supposed to be a technical organization, it is in reality too often governed by political imperatives. Critics also contend that the diverse timetables for the final applications for territorial extensions makes it difficult for states to coordinate and cooperate among themselves to resolve any differences in a transparent manner. Protection of international commercial transit is especially salient with reference to the safe transportation of oil and gas, which could become a major issue once commercial and technological changes allow the large-scale exploitation of Arctic resources. UNCLOS clearly defines what constitutes a state's economic zone, 200 miles from the coastline, its contiguous zone, and other critical factors. The failure of the U.S. to join UNCLOS, in my view, represents an abnegation of U.S. leadership and allows vitally important maritime states such as Malaysia and Indonesia to cite the U.S. refusal to sign UNCLOS as one of the principal reasons they have declined to join the Proliferation Security Initiative, which blocks shipments of nuclear and missile technologies to rogue states. Russia, Norway, Canada, and Denmark are already in line with extension applications to UNCLOS. Russia was the first to submit its claim in 2001. However, owing to the insufficient evidence presented, it must resubmit its claim by 2011. Norway submitted in 2006, Canada will submit by 2013, and Denmark shortly thereafter. Let me turn quickly to something called the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council was founded in 1996 and is not an international organization with a firm legal charter, but rather an international forum designed to foster cooperation and collaboration on vital Arctic issues. During the deliberations that formed the organization, the U.S. was adamant that the Arctic Council should not, as part of its mandate, discuss national security issues. Member states are satisfied that within its well-defined limits, the system serves as a good forum for the expression of their views and concerns. Almost all of the members, for a wide variety of reasons, are opposed to setting up a new system, broadening the Council's mandate, or to ceding sovereignty over the region to an international organization such as the UN Security Council or the General Assembly. However, most of the Council members realize that the Arctic is changing rapidly and that increased cooperation on issues of transborder interest must be cultivated. The U.S. reiterated its commitment to the Arctic Council as, quote, a high-level forum this year. While being open to reorganization and updating of the forum structure, the U.S. also reaffirmed its aversion to any expansion of the Council's expressly limited mandate. The Aleutian Declaration, signed in May 2008, emphasizes that UNCLOS is a commitment of the entire group of the Arctic Council, and that there is no need for a new international legal regime. Most organs of the U.S. government support this point of view, even though, once again, the U.S. has not signed UNCLOS. The Council's 2009 Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment recommends that the 8 Arctic states formulate a harmonized search and rescue instrument, which involves pooling their financial and technical resources to meet the challenges of the region. The assessment also includes recommendations about harmonized and mandatory shipbuilding standards for ships navigating Arctic waters in cooperation with the International Maritime Organization. It also calls for improved navigation infrastructure, including navigation charts and communication systems, development of harmonized maritime traffic awareness systems, and guidelines on oil and gas exploration. Let me turn quickly to some major bilateral issues. Because the Arctic is a semi-enclosed sea encircled by littoral states, extensions of continental shelves and delimitations of maritime boundaries will lead invariably to overlapping sovereignty claims. Norway has been a major source of energy security for Europe with new discoveries of Arctic gas, especially in the light of recent Russian curtailments of gas to Europe through the Ukraine. With additional gas pipelines planned by Russia from its own Arctic and other natural gas resources, Norwegian gas will remain a critical component of European energy supply security. The importance of Norway for European energy security means, however, that Norway must explore ever further northwards, creating tensions with Russia in terms of territorial claims over the disputed boundary of the Barents Sea. Norway claims that its so-called Gackle Ridge is an extension of its continental shelf, but Russia rejects such claims. We go back to the map here. Naval maneuvers by Russia have disrupted Norwegian air traffic in offshore areas, and there is often aerial harassment between Russian fighter jets and Norwegian jets trying to intercept them at the border. Norway, a NATO state, has moved its entire center of military operations from its southern location outside Stavanger to the far north, reinforcing the strategic importance of the high north, both to Norwegian and NATO foreign policy, and giving the Russians a real headache. The Spitsbergen Treaty of 1920 grants Norway territorial sovereignty over what is known as the Svalbard Archipelago, again, the small region islands to the north of Norway. At the time the treaty was negotiated, states had the exclusive legal right to resources in their territorial waters up to a distance of 3 miles only from the coastline. However, the treaty also provides for equal access to the archipelago's resources by all signatory powers. On this basis, Russia has operated a coaling station in the islands for years. With changes under international law brought about by UNCLOS and other legal regimes over the years, Russia argues that as a signatory to the Spitsbergen Treaty, it has the right to look for resources further offshore, though clearly under a resource extraction regime that would remain under Norway's legal jurisdiction. The significance of these claims should not be underestimated, especially given Norway's membership of NATO. During the Cold War, the region between Svalbard and northern Norway was the center of a dangerous cat-and-mouse game between NATO and the Soviet Union. At the time, Soviet strategic doctrine was based on the necessity, either before the outbreak of a conflict with the West or in its earliest hours, to move its northern fleet out of Murmansk and into the North Atlantic through this gap between Svalbard and Norway. The same remains true of Russian strategic doctrine today. This action was deemed vital for Russia's forced projection into the Atlantic, or in the worst case, for a strategic nuclear strike against the American East Coast. Clearly, Moscow's worst fear is that NATO could bottle its fleet up, severely affecting the balance of forces in a major conflict. Even since the end of the Cold War and the attendant fears of nuclear annihilation, annihilation, Russia has remained nervous that offshore listening platforms might be installed on offshore oil and gas production platforms, providing NATO with important capabilities for monitoring Russian commercial and strategic activities in the region. Two of the most sensitive issues involving claims for additional offshore territorial extensions under UNCLOS center on conflicting claims by Russia, Denmark, and Canada over two rather obscure ridges. Each country claims that the ridges are natural geologic extensions of their territory, and each is collecting geologics data to support its claims. In August 2007, Russian explorers even planted a titanium flag on the seabed of one of these ridges, mainly for domestic political consumption, but also to send a message about their perceptions of sovereignty to other Arctic states. In March 2009, Russia announced plans to establish a military force to protect its Arctic interests, as the region is expected to become an extremely important supplier of energy resources, particularly in the Russian Arctic. While some of Russia's actions may be perceived as aggressive, fears about the political militarization of the Arctic, I believe, at this stage are unwarranted. In contrast to alarming rhetoric by some conservative think tanks in Washington and elsewhere, relations among the Arctic powers have thus far been characterized by a spirit of cooperation with outstanding disputes managed generally peacefully. In May 2000 of this year, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called for cooperation between their two countries in the region. The U.S. continues to request the Russian Federation to ratify the U.S. maritime boundary agreements delineating the maritime boundary between Russia and Alaska through the Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea into the Arctic Ocean. That boundary is still not recognized by either country. Russia, in turn, called for increased cooperation with Canada in Arctic management at a press conference on June 30th of this year. Soon thereafter, Prime Minister Putin declared 3.7 million acres in the Russian Arctic as a national park, signaling that Russia apparently believes it has more to gain by following international law and demonstrating ecological sensitivity rather than aggressively asserting its sovereignty. Among the other Arctic littoral states, Canada is setting up a deep-water docking port on Baffin Island and opening an Arctic military training center in Resolute Bay in an attempt to bolster its territorial claims to its high northern islands. The U.S. and Canada, as noted, have unresolved overlapping claims, not only over the international boundary between the two countries through the Beaufort Sea, but also on access to the sea floor. Resolution of this matter is especially important since there is believed to be tremendous oil and gas potential off Alaska, which is often referred to in the petroleum industry as, quote, the next Gulf of Mexico. Further to the east, Denmark and Canada have territorial disputes over an obscure island called Hans Island, which separates Greenland from Ellesmere Island in Canada. Denmark claims that Hans Island, and this is only important again because if you own the island, you got 200 miles out to develop its resources. Denmark claims that Hans Island is part of Greenland and has been an integral part of Denmark since 1953. The continental shelf between Greenland and Canada was delimited by Canada and Denmark in a decision ratified in 1973. The treaty, however, does not draw a line through Hans Island, however, as its status remains in dispute. Since then, both countries have planted flags on the island. Some of this gets really fun. The Danes in 1984, provoked by the presence of a Canadian explorer from Dome Petroleum Company, and the Canadians in 2005. Hans Island has taken on a significant disproportionate importance to its size as a symbol of Arctic sovereignty between the two countries because of the possibility of large hydrocarbon resources in the region. Greenland obtained self-government from the Danish Parliament in '79. It then voted for increased self-rule in November 2008. The issue of Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland, which is based on historic exploration and settlement, became more complex in June of this year, when Greenland obtained a new self-government agreement under which it is recognized by the international community as a separate entity from Denmark, with control of its internal affairs and of any international agreements pertaining specifically to Greenland. specifically remains without much definition to it. Denmark will retain control over foreign affairs, defense, and finances, but will gradually decrease its substantial annual subsidy, which covers 60% of Greenland's budget, and cedes some control of Greenland's natural resources. Greenland's new status will move it towards independence. This development was anticipated by many analysts, given the possibility of sizable oil and gas as well as diamond reserves in Greenland. Already additional new areas of concern are arising which pose geopolitical challenges to the region. For example, in October 2007, a new small island was discovered off the coast of Greenland when a shifting ice pack to the northeast revealed it for the first time. Although it was formed by land debris and erosion deposits rather than a tectonic creation, its emergence from the melting ice is an example of how much is still unknown about the complex geography of the region. Should this island, known as Stray Dog West, fulfill the criteria required to gain definition as an island, it will be added to maps and will grant Denmark additional fishing rights and seabed claims. Other locations that were thought to be parts of singular entities, such as Warming Island and Franz Josef Island north of Russia, have been revealed to be multiple land masses once the ice connecting them melted. As noted above, the question of access to the Arctic is relevant not only to states in the region, but also to those further south. Arctic shipping routes are an attractive prospect, in theory, to China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. South Korea is one of the major builders of ice-capable vessels. China carried out Arctic research in 1999, 2003, and in 2004 built an Arctic satellite observation center in Spitsbergen. The construction of such centers has been permitted by the Norwegian government for the original signatories to the 1920 treaty. And China, Japan, Italy, France, South Korea, among others, have taken advantage of the opportunity. China's application to the Arctic Council for permanent observer status, however, was turned down this year, and the full ministerial meeting of the Council will not convene again to consider additional applications till 2011. Also turned down were applications by the European Union, South Korea, and Italy. While the Arctic Council and the Arctic 5 major littoral states want effective implementation of existing regimes, the European Union advocates establishing a new regime, an international treaty for the protection of the Arctic. The European Parliament sees Arctic policy as vital to European security, and in March 2008 stated that the conventions needed to be altered to reflect the potential new energy balance stemming from the discovery of Arctic resources while reducing the size of Norwegian claims in the region. While the EU remains committed to UNCLOS and recognizes the work of the Atlantic Council, the European Parliament has called for specific U.S. Arctic policies to increase the role the EU can play in the region to enhance current multilateral agreements or make up shortcomings. Given the USGS assessment of the potential for substantial resources, it is possible that a serious diplomatic row may at some point break out among nations that border the region, including those that want their territorial extended, those that argue that some of the Arctic belongs to no one and that they should therefore have unfettered access, and those that believe, given its fragile and unique ecological system, that the region, or at least large areas of it, are the common heritage of mankind and should be put under international jurisdiction. What should we do about this? Arctic access and exploration is not a matter for the future. The Arctic's time has already come. However, it will gain in geopolitical importance only where there is a confluence of factors. Oil prices will have to rise and be expected to remain high enough to justify costly technological and infrastructure development. Ice-capable technology will have to be available to ensure access to the region can be sustained over time despite seasonal and yearly ice fluctuations. The geopolitical community must be convinced that opportunities for commercial development will not accentuate greenhouse gas emissions and the degradation of the Arctic environment to an unacceptable degree. Interest in new maritime shipping routes already high will continue to increase in direct proportion to geopolitical tensions in traditional shipping choke points and channels, especially where potential military conflicts are brewing. Heightened commercial and other interests in the Arctic will rise when boundaries are clearly delimited, legal frameworks put in place to create a favorable investment environment, and when all Arctic states agree to abide by internationally recognized legally binding arrangements. The U.S. has over 1,000 miles of Arctic coastline. If the U.S. wishes to play a leading role in creating an effective regime for the region, as well as protecting our own interests, Washington must focus funds and policy attention on the Arctic. The actions it should take, in my view, include signing UNCLOS, putting innovation to work on ice-capable technologies and military training, cooperating with Canada and other Arctic states on improved management of maritime traffic, research efforts into major environmental questions, and search and rescue, and develop search and rescue and accident cleanup capabilities while building a sizable ice-capable commercial and scientific fleet. In the current economic climate, none of these things will be easy to find resources for a region of the world that in most people's minds seem far away, but I hope I've given you some clue that to our north, momentous events are occurring which may not affect our lives today or tomorrow, but they're not going to go away. Thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to take questions.